Have you met a murderer? What were they like? Pretty friendly guy trying to put his life back together. He was a bit awkward due to habits picked up being in prison for over 12 years. He didn't make eye contact or shake hands when I met him. He was extremely guarded about expressing his thoughts and feelings. His speech was slow and quiet, etc. He was honestly sorry for what he had done, and he was willing to talk about the crime and his prison time with people after he got to know them a bit. Sadly, he ended up selling drugs because he couldn't find a legal way to make money. He was caught, and now he is back in prison, probably for the rest of his life. I haven't been in touch with him or anyone else who knew him for a long time. This guy seems to have had a rough journey. Being in prison for that long must change a person. It's understandable he would struggle with social interactions. It's a shame he tried to turn things around, but then fell back into crime. Now he's trapped again. It's tough to see someone trying, but ending up in the same place. Wonder how others in his life feel about it all now. First one I met was quiet, reserved, and timid. He killed his wife and her lover. Crime of passion. Had been out of prison for 15 or 20 years at that point. Second one I met is actually my ex-brother-in-law. He's a stupid hick who is quick to anger, and the madder he gets, the more stupid he gets. He pulled a knife on me, but the police showed up because his parents called him earlier. He tried cutting his own throat with his knife, screaming, "They'll never take me alive," but his knife was too dull. I would have offered him mine, but the cops had already started beating his stupid ass. Less than a year later, he stabbed a 15-year-old boy to death. I'm fairly sure I know another murderer, but there wasn't the evidence to convict him. This is pretty dark stuff. Meeting people with that kind of history must be unsettling. The second guy sounds particularly unstable. It's wild how emotions can lead to something so violent. And then there's the idea of knowing another possible murderer without proof. That's heavy. Overall, it's a tough situation to deal with when you cross paths with people like that. Life can be unpredictable. I used to work in a prison, specifically as an administrator for a team of support workers within the prison. Our office was directly on one of the wings. One of the things about prison is that all the non-qualified/secure jobs can and are done by prisoners. Things like cleaning, cooking, laundry, and so on are done by trusted prisoners. We had one for our office who, when the prisoners were allowed free roam, was allowed into our office to empty bins, vacuum, and clean as necessary. He was trusted and had a good rapport with the team. Nice bloke, actually talked a lot about his family and how he always looked forwards to visits and so on. To get such a position, he essentially needed to be vetted by the prison board as deemed to be safe, i.e., no in-prison violence, no issues with officers, and so on. As should be obvious for this being in this topic, he was in for murder, which genuinely surprised me when I found out, because he always seemed happy, friendly, and just like absolutely any other person. I would not have guessed he was in for murder at all, and had assumed he was in for drug-related crime, or at worst manslaughter. But nope, turned out he still had 9 years left on a 20-year sentence for murder. I probably met other murderers, came with the environment after all, but he was probably the one who surprised me most. That's quite an interesting situation. It's surprising how people can have different sides to their personality. The contrast between the guy's everyday behavior and his serious charge shows that appearances can be deceiving. Trust must be a big deal in that environment, especially with someone who has a violent history. It makes you think about how you can't really judge a book by its cover, even in a prison setting. I've met two. The male I still have contact with almost daily. He is educated. He holds a BA in psychology, but seems to be directed by a combination of street code and fucked up self-justified morals that explain the things in his past. He's calculating, but I have never felt him try to play me at all. I know that he preys on people less intelligent or confident, though. The female was quiet. She didn't really seem capable of killing, to be honest, but I do believe she did it. She never ended a sentence with anything but "sir" when I was dealing with her. I did get a very cold chill from her a few times when I saw her interact with her attorneys and other inmates. There was this look in her eyes that was actually scary coming from someone 5 feet 2 inches, 100 pounds. Sort of a "you don't know what I'm capable of" air to her in the mousiest, most unassuming way. Your experiences with both of them are interesting. The contrast between the male's street code and the female's intimidating presence is striking. Makes you think about how people can present themselves in unexpected ways. It's wild how someone so seemingly small can carry such a heavy aura. Those subtle traits can really change how you perceive someone, even if they don't fit the usual mold. One of my relatives was involved in organized crime back in the 70s and 80s. He was never arrested or anything, but he definitely killed several people and injured many more. He was one of the resident tough guys. His name comes up in pretty much any book that's been written about the time period. He got involved when he was young, and by the time I knew him, he was a really quiet guy, obviously just trying to keep his head down. No wife, no kids. I was a really shy teenager, but I loved hockey, and he'd always talk sports with me. He died a few years ago, and he didn't want any services. He was cremated and put in the same grave as his parents. I know he did horrible things, but I felt bad for him. He spent most of his life trying to go as unnoticed as possible, doing the bare minimum to survive and bother as few people as possible. That's an interesting perspective. He sounds like a complicated figure, having a dark past but trying to blend in later on. It's odd how people can live such starkly different lives. It's a shame he didn't find peace or connection, especially since you two shared those moments over sports. Reflecting on the past can bring up mixed feelings, especially about family. It's a tough balance to strike between understanding and judgment. Retired physician I got to know a few years ago. He has since passed away. He was an intern at a hospital in the 1960s. The hospital had an elderly woman patient with advanced terminal ovarian cancer. She probably had a few days of life left. Her cancer had spread everywhere, and she was screaming in pain whenever she was awake. Her only relief was to receive so much morphine, she was virtually unconscious. This doctor was directed by his boss to euthanize the patient with an overdose of morphine. He did so, partly because he was told to do so, and partly because the lady was suffering excruciating pain. Technically, this was murder, even though it was probably justifiable, depending on your opinion of euthanasia. The incident bothered him for the rest of his life, because physicians and the general public have not come to terms with the concept of a dignified, humane death under such circumstances. Otherwise, this doctor was a completely decent, caring, and professional person. It's a tough situation. The doctor was caught between his duty and the patient's suffering. Euthanasia raises complex ethical questions, especially in cases of terminal illness and extreme pain. It sounds like he struggled with the impact of his actions for years. It's interesting how society views the concept of a humane death, and that can weigh heavily on professionals in the field. Overall, it's a heavy topic. I'd known and detested one man for years before I found out he was a murderer. He was a frequent customer at a local business and one of the most ill-tempered, obnoxious people I've ever had the misfortune to meet. The business owners always bent over backwards to accommodate him, and none of the other customers complained about his behavior. Turns out he'd hacked his business partner to pieces and buried him, and then got his original conviction overturned on a technicality. He liked to brag that he'd gotten away with murder. That's a pretty wild story. It's interesting how people can have these hidden layers. The guy sounds really unpleasant, and then to find out he's a murderer is just unsettling. It's strange that others didn't see through his behavior. The technicality angle adds another layer of frustration. It's like he's taking advantage of the system while being a terrible person overall. I went to an event where ex-cons talked about their experiences in prison. Everyone going knew there was a murderer, but we didn't know who they were. Right at the end, it turned out it was the guy who had been hosting the talk. He had been drunk, and a naked guy tried to hug him in the street. He punched the guy and carried on his way. The police found the naked guy lying dead in a nearby building several hours later. The man who threw the punch denied killing him and said whoever moved the body inside a building must have done it, but nevertheless he was convicted of murder. That's a pretty wild story. The twist at the end with the host being the murderer is unexpected. It raises a lot of questions about the whole situation. It's strange how things can escalate so quickly, especially when alcohol is involved. The fact that he was convicted based on those circumstances shows how complicated the justice system can be. Definitely a memorable event, for better or worse. Back in my Army days, I boxed. There was a guy that came up to me and challenged me. We sparred for a bit before all was said and done. He was really cocky, but not all that talented. About a year later, my friend that boxed with me sent me a text with a news story. Apparently, the guy that challenged me ended up being stationed up in Fort Meade. He was dating an underage girl with extreme disapproval from her mother. He killed the girl's mother. All in all, I would say the guy was really self-centered. He didn't seem to have any interest in anything other people said. He was quiet, but never hesitant to brag about his own accomplishments. He was obviously a liar. He would say that he knew how to box and that he won competitions, but he didn't even have the basics down. I think that he pretty much fit the bill of someone that could turn out to be a killer. It's really sad that it happened, but from what I understand, he has no remorse. That's a pretty intense story. It's interesting how some people can come off as confident but lack real skill or decency. It's unsettling to see how someone can go from being cocky in the ring to being involved in something so serious. It's a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. The lack of remorse in cases like this is really disturbing. It just goes to show that you never really know someone's true character. Very nice and quiet. He was older, and I think he had done a lot of time in prison for his crime. I never asked, but our boss told me this was his first job upon getting out. He never complained about anything, not even the rude customers. He needed to change apartments at one point and had no one to help him, so I offered. He declined the first 2 times, but once he started moving his things, he knew he needed another hand. There were only a few things that needed 2 people. He didn't own a lot. It took less than an hour to get it all done. When we were finished, he offered me a beer and a seat to pay me back. We watched the John Waters film Cry Baby and just chilled, drinking a few beers together. Eventually, I had to go meet my girlfriend. I ended up getting a better job shortly after that, so I never found out his whole story. I don't know who he was in his past, or how heinous his crimes were. But when I knew him, he was a decent guy who just did his job and lived his life and seemed too tired for trouble anymore. It's interesting how people's past can shape who they are now. This guy seems to have found a way to move on and live a quiet life. Helping him out shows a bit of kindness in an otherwise tough situation. Hanging out and catching a movie with him sounds chill. Life moves on, and sometimes you don't get the full story, but that doesn't change what's in front of you. A friend of mine from college committed a murder-suicide. I never found out the details of the murder, as it was years after I knew him. He had been a college football player. He was taken out due to an injury and never played again. He was a tall, good-looking guy who was popular with the ladies but always expected a commitment and only got fangirls who wanted to brag that they'd hooked up with a football player from TV. Honestly, I feel like he was a little pushed around. His personality wasn't as big as his stature, and he was a sensitive, bright guy who was never given a chance to develop intellectually or emotionally because he'd ended up on a particular track in life. I think that the folks around him cared for him, but smothered his chances to develop into a normal adult man. I'd bet that this explains a lot of the antics that you see football stars get into. Anyway, every week it was him getting his heart broken by a girl he was sure would be different. The murder-suicide was a girlfriend of his, so I imagine it was the same. That's a tough situation. It sounds like your friend had a lot of pressure on him, especially after losing his football career. It's common for people in the spotlight to struggle when they're not allowed to grow or be themselves. The heartbreak must have hit hard, and it's tragic that it ended the way it did. It does reflect how important emotional support is for anyone, especially in those high-pressure environments. Nicest dude I know. Got into a fight with someone much smaller than him when he was 18, punched a guy in the chin, dude went down and smacked his head off a curb. By the time they got him to the hospital, he was brain dead and died a couple days later. My friend was charged with manslaughter and served his time in prison. I met his after he got out. He's an artist now with a beautiful family. We never talk about it, but I'm sure he regrets his actions that day. But how would you ever know something like that was going to happen? That's a heavy story. It's tough to think about how one moment can change everything. Seems like your friend learned a hard lesson and managed to turn his life around. It's interesting how people can grow and become better after going through something like that. Not easy to carry that burden though. A lot of things happen without warning, and it's hard to predict the outcomes.